So when your back's up against the wall, where do you go? Do you run away? Well, the wall's behind you. There's nowhere to run to, is there? Or do you stand and fight back? And that was the decision that we all had to make in the British National Party. Of course, half of the BNP activists did run. All tried to make a stand, unsuccessfully. It was courageous, but foolhardy, really, in a sense. They should have stood back, in my opinion. But half of us did fight back. And it's odd because really that was the title emblazoned across the British National Party's election manifesto, fight back. And so drawing on the, I could say the inspiration, oddly enough, of extremely violent left-wing groups in Europe, like Action Direct, we decided on a policy of direct action. So what does direct action mean? What did it mean? Well, direct action meant taking the battle to the enemy, that we were no longer going to sit back and take it. Quite frankly, the NF in the 70s, they did take it. They took an awful lot of it. And they could have done far more. They could have been far more proactive, but they weren't. For whatever reasons known only to John Tyndall and Martin Webster, I guess, really, and the committee system. But that was never the case in the BNP when Tyndall had total control over it. We decided on a policy of direct action. So we took it to them. What was it like facing the different types of red factions, left-wing groups? Let's call them red factions, because that's what we knew with them as, the Reds. Yes, commies, Reds, lefts, whatever. They're all Reds to us. That's what we called them. We didn't differentiate. We didn't call them Leninists or Trotskyists, socialists. It was just completely immaterial. They were all Reds. And facing all the different red factions was an interesting experience in actual fact, because the Socialist Workers' Party, for example, who also masqueraded under another banner, ANL, or ANL as we used to call them, the Anti-Nazi League, self-styled Anti-Nazi League. I mean, they were laughable, truly. They were the most numerous, certainly. They were the cannon fodder of the red factions, basically. And, oh my goodness, yeah. They were diabolical, truly, they were. And I remember confronting them on the streets many times, and not even with force in actual fact, but just to talk to them. And they would come up with absolutely ridiculous, obtuse arguments about, such as, I'm neither from Moscow nor Washington, when you actually challenge them on their red ideology. It was just absolute drivel, in actual fact, to be perfectly honest with you. And the whole purpose of dealing with them, because they were so very violent in actual fact, and even the SWP, who really couldn't handle themselves at all, the vast majority of them, they advocated the use of force. In fact, their placards always carried a slogan. It was like their holy mantra, smash the BNP. In fact, Diane Abbott MP actually borrowed the same phrase before she sent Red Action and the Black Panthers, accompanied by the Metropolitan Police, into Bermondsey to get absolutely trashed, in actual fact. And afterwards, Red Action spokesman told the press the only victory they had that day was getting out of Bermondsey alive. Well, they shouldn't have gone in there, quite frankly, at all. They were warned in advance, don't come into Bermondsey. We will not tolerate this red extremism, particularly with that violent Black Panther unit. And so what happened to them was entirely their own fault. And they've no one to blame but themselves. But they will always blame it on the BNP. Not true at all, in actual fact. They were given fair warning. In fact, I don't think they even deserved fair warning, but they were given one anyway. And they ignored the warning because they were hell-bent on violence. And so facing the SWP, they were usually very scruffy, in actual fact. They always used to stink of body odor, and nicotine and weed and alcohol, cider, beer, etc. And they looked like they'd not had a wash for at least a month. And we used to call them the Socialist Wankers Party, in actual fact. because they were wankers, in our opinion. You know, they just couldn't do it, even though they were the group advocating force more than anyone else, quite frankly, which is quite odd. But they themselves just couldn't do it. I mean, there were one or two of them that could do the business, but the vast majority of them now, absolutely useless. But I remember the first ever face-off I had with the Reds was at New Parks in Leicester. I mean, we had some shouty experiences with them elsewhere, but the very first serious face-off with the Reds was at New Parks in Leicester. And there we encountered a new type of Red. That's my perception of it, thinking back on it, the retrospect. These were very unpleasant, very ugly people, nasty people, hell-bent on violence, quite frankly. Because let's cut all the crap about these people being anti-racist protesters, which is how the press portrayed them every single time. They were portrayed as these poor, innocent little anti-racist protesters who'd only come out to oppose the nasty British National Party. Absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. And I'll explain to you now one reason why that is. So I remember being stood with the police line in between us. Of course, they felt emboldened by that. It made them even more bellicose and threatening and abusive because they knew the coppers were there to protect them. Had the coppers not been there to protect them, after they said what I'm about to tell you now, it would have been all over for them, even on their own turf, you know. So one of the Reds, dreadlocked, he was in actual fact, a real scruffy, goodness me, I can't even put it into the proper words because of the YouTube algorithm. That's what I'm constantly struggling against when describing these people. So I have to be as polite and reasonable as possible. So yeah, this creature with John Peacock stood 2 places to my left, who was the Midlands organiser at that time. He started saying, "Where's your daughter, Peacock? Is she not good enough for the master race? Come on, Peacock, where's your daughter? Is she not good enough for the master race?" And so this obviously then incited a chorus of abuse. And he stood there, stern-faced, and took it like a man in actual fact, with great strength of character. He never said a single word back to them. In reply, nothing at all. You know, the man was made of stone, quite frankly, and he was an Odinist leader as well as a British National Party leader. And that's where I became an Odinist, because of John Peacock. Even though in truth, I didn't realise that when I was 15 years old what it was, but I just didn't find anyone to help me to pursue the path of Odinism until I met John Peacock. It's almost as though all these years later, after I led the funeral oration for him in Sherwood Forest, it's like he's stood by me right now. It's a really odd feeling in actual fact. It's just like he stood by me on that demonstration at New Parks in Leicester. And he was a very strong man, you know, very strong man. And he endured that horrible, appalling abuse. And we all wanted to break through the police lines, quite frankly, and fill the Reds in. And that's exactly what would have happened had it not been for Mr. Peacock. He was the one who urged us not to do it. In fact, ordered us not to do it. And of course, Mr. Tyndall was just arriving from London to give a speech. And yeah, so I actually said to my 2IC, and people keep saying to me, "Why don't you name your 2IC?" Well, I did so before, and it caused him a lot of problems at work, you know, so I'm not out to cause him problems in his workplace and get him sacked, you know. I'm not going to do the Reds' work for them, quite frankly. That's just the way it is. And so I will continue to refer to him as the 2IC. I think everybody knows who he is anyway, you know, in honesty. But I said to him, you know, what were they talking about? Saying this to Peacock about why is his daughter not good enough for the master race? What type of sickening thing is that? I actually said to him, is she in a, you know, an interracial relationship or something? And he said, no, he says, you know, Peacock doesn't like to talk about it, but his daughter's actually disabled in a wheelchair. And I was like, absolutely sickened. Absolutely sickened. And from that moment on, something switched in here. Switched in here immediately. And I looked at those Reds with pure, unbridled hatred, you know. And I made a decision that day, you know, from now on, there was going to be no quarter given, no quarter asked. And it was an absolutely shocking, appalling thing to witness. To say such a thing to a man about his daughter, who was completely innocent. And it just goes to show you these people have absolutely no interest in love, peace, forgiveness, and tolerance, and all the other claptrap sound bites that they spout. They were really ugly, horrible, disgusting people, quite frankly. And of course, the police protected them the whole time. The police would say that they were just trying to, you know, stop a public order incident. In fact, they protected them. And they even let them into the election meeting. You know, their superintendent insisted, Leicestershire police, doesn't matter which police they are, you know, they're all left-wing and bent, quite frankly. He insisted that half the hall be packed with Reds, you know, because that was only fair under the Representation of the People Act. As though the police give a damn about the Representation of the People Act. My goodness. Honestly. It was done deliberately to incite a battle. And so what happened was we went into the hall, which was to the left where Mr. Peacock was stood. And yeah, half of them were allowed in. And Mr. Tinder was trying to speak. And one after the other, they were rejected by the stewarding groups and the police at the back. You know, but it was simply a case of disruptive action. If the police hadn't have been there, we'd have cleared the entire area of these vile Reds very quickly, you know, with direct action. That's what direct action means, okay? And for anyone who says that direct action was wrong, well, quite frankly, I can only say, looking back on it, that in a scenario like that, direct action was completely justified. And I never had a problem with it, in truth. And that incident that day, watching Mr. Peacock take that, yeah, as I said, it changed me. And I remember a few months later in Leicester city centre, again with Mr. Peacock stood to my left, and Red Action turned up. You know, these were the men who thought they were the hardcore street fighters. Nearly all of them were criminals, quite frankly, criminal underworld, degenerates, criminal degenerates, you know. And Red Action was a part-time hobby for them, because they just love violence, quite frankly. And they've been brainwashed by leftism, but primarily they were into drug dealing and racketeering and money laundering and protection rackets. They were just criminals. Let's be honest with you, criminals and football hooligans, that's all Red Action were, you know? So forget all the nonsense about ideological beliefs. Yes, I'm sure they did have some ideological belief which drove their communist fanaticism. But these people were just criminals. It was no surprise at all when we discovered later that they were actually operating inside IRA active service units on the mainland. And also, I discovered recently that some of them were involved with the INLA as well, you know. But yeah, I remember this Red Action guy. You know, the rest of them stood back, and he came up. He was particularly mouthy, very aggressive, you know, a real gobshite, quite frankly. And I walked in towards him, basically, to put an end to his abuse. And Mr. Peacock said to me, "Simon, don't do it, please. Control yourself." And it hadn't been for Mr. Peacock doing that day, because he was my boss. Yeah, I mean, he'd have been out very quickly, because that was the policy after New Parks in Leicester, you know. And so it just petered out with Red Action giving it the big one, as they say today in the common parlance. Giving it the big one, in it, Sam. And off they trotted. And yeah, I mean, in truth, thinking back on it, on the day, I was actually very disappointed, because I wanted them to have a go, you know. And because I was fully embroiled in it by then, at that time. And it didn't bother me in the slightest. And so Red Action, yeah, when I faced off against Red Action in Chesterfield, not far away from Leicester in the East Midlands, they got spotters on the ground, and we were selling a newspaper with the title "Hang Child Murderers," And we were handing out leaflets with the same title as well. It was the very first campaign the country had ever seen against grooming gangs, or what John Tyndall called Asian attacks on white children. And yeah, it was pretty much the same type of rabble, in actual fact, violent criminal rabble that came to Chesterfield. And Nick Lowles actually admits in Codename Arthur, you know, his fantasy about an undercover mole inside the BNP. It's actually a combination of all those 30% snitches I was talking about in the video I made last night. That's really what Codename Arthur was. You know, that's just his legend, his cover story for it. And it's to make the people inside the BNP and Nationalism say even more paranoid than they are. Well, I'm not. I'm ice cold, quite frankly, about all of it. And so when they came to Chesterfield, and obviously my TIC said, you know, we're going to have to leave soon because we're going to be very badly outnumbered. They're calling in reinforcements from Sheffield. And so the vanguard came in and we took them out very quickly, very easy. And once the others saw their vanguard get taken out, because apparently these were their lead fighters, they were out in seconds, both of them, totally out cold. And the rest of them backed off. And SWP, no, they wouldn't have done anything like that, you see, because the thing with SWP is they needed numbers. If they weren't outnumbering you 6 or 10 to 1, they weren't game for any form of aggro. It was only when they got the mob factor, you know, that they really wanted to have a go. And they weren't much good even then, quite frankly. You know, and they love using their lollipop sticks as weapons as well, with their smash the BNP on it, and goodness knows what other infantile left-wing abuse they'd adopted from Moscow or Washington, according to them. Neither, in actual fact, according to them, which is quite odd. It was organically bred, was it? Well, it was, in fact, wasn't it? You know, because Karl Marx hatched that poison here in Britain and published his manifesto in Manchester. So I guess they were right in a sense, weren't they? You know, this is an homegrown but non-British asocial disease. Communism, leftism, full stop, socialism. Call it whatever you will, that's what it is. It's a delusion, a fantasy. So, class war. Now, that was a different matter entirely. I mean, they were totally game for it, class war. But they weren't the tough guy types of Red Action. No, class war, they were like a cross, a hybrid of Red Action and the Socialist Workers' Party. And so, yeah, I mean, they had all the ideological fervour of the SWP and also Red Action, but they didn't quite have the street prowess of Red Action. And because of that, they used weapons. So, you know, when you were up against class war, you would always see them with bike chains, etc. CS gas canisters, CS gas grenades, baseball bats, iron bars, bricks, you name it. That was the standard fare when dealing with class war. You know, they were weapons men, quite frankly. And most of them were criminal degenerates as well, junkies. In fact, I know one class war guy who became a born-again Christian, which is absolutely hilarious. From one Abrahamic disease to another Abrahamic disease, in actual fact. Work that one out if you can. I'm glad I've never had to, because I've never suffered from the Abrahamic disease. I never will. So, yes, he became a born-again Christian. But prior to that, he was an heroin addict. He was influential in class war in the East Midlands. And one of his specialities was torturing people to extract drug debts. You know, this is the type of people we're talking about. We're not talking about law-abiding citizens, you know, protecting society from some sort of radicals inside the British National Party. On the contrary, the left were the real fanatics. But what we had to do to carry out our business, our lawful business, under the Representation of the People Act, was to use direct action. And that's what it was like the whole time, quite frankly. And occasionally you'd face them all together. Even though the SWP would often say, with the liars at Searchlight magazine, we don't have anything to do with the squadism of Red Action. It's all nonsense. Same with the Labour Party and the trade unions funding it. They all said the same thing. It was just a public relations stunt. But whenever it came to the crunch, they would back Red Action, and often you'd find them in league with them, you know. And I've been on several demonstrations, quite large demonstrations in actual fact, that turned very, very ugly, you know, direct action ugly. And SWP, Class War, Red Action, all there together, you know, and the police as well. You know, so when we were up against it, we had to take on the police, the SWP, Red Action, Class War, and there are other umbrella organisations like Anti-Fascist Action, you know, which is another one of their fantasies, you know, Anti-Fascist Action. I mean, all of these iterations of fascism, nationalism, and even National Socialism were a direct reaction to extreme leftism sweeping across Europe. And we all know who's responsible for that, don't we? But we can't say it because of the YouTube algorithm, you know. Perhaps Tommy Robinson's handler could apprise us of who they are. I'm sure it could. Ezra Levant, his name, isn't it? From the Levant? Of the Levant? There you go. There's a very obvious clue. So, yes, that was the problem, basically. That's what we're up against, these extremely violent left-wing groups who had no interest in taking part in the democratic process. They didn't want to win power at the ballot box, which the BNP did. And so, of course, you know, we had to use Action direct action. And what was it like actually doing it? Well, it was thrilling, in truth. Yeah, absolutely, you know. I mean, I can, all these years later, I can still hear, you know, sirens off in the distance. Truly. They're like ghosts, really. And memories are ghosts, in actual fact. And, oh yeah, I can hear, you know, particularly the November 1992 incident, which was so intense, so full on, in actual fact, it stuck with me for years afterwards. I can still hear those sirens right now. I can still see it, you know. I close my eyes, I can still see it in my mind's eye. You know, everything in graphic detail. As I've always had a photographic memory, which I inherited from my grandmother, Jenny. And yeah, so, you know, it's a blessing and a curse, all rolled into one, quite frankly. But yeah, I mean, I can still hear it right now. At this moment, I've conjured it up, brought it back to life, to recount it to you. And yeah, I can remember those 11 TSGs coming around the corner of a very long street into Bethnal Green. And, you know, and the chaos, absolute chaos, the commotion, the frenzy. And then it was like suddenly being startled by this explosion of sirens inbound. And so the whole animus changed. Quick, let's get out of here. Let's go now. And so the vast majority of us did. But they'd also come in from a different direction as well. You know, there was 11 in that fleet, and there were several others that came in on the right flank to cut us off, which made strategic sense. And so there was a massive deployment, quite frankly. And obviously, how did they know? Well, of course, from all of their snitches and moles inside both organisations, didn't they? You know, they knew what was going to happen, and but they just weren't there on the scene to stop it. And so yeah, a lot of our lads actually got nicked and remanded to HMP Brixton, and that's just the way it was. They were all later released without being prosecuted, and the charges against them were dropped. And yeah, I mean, do I regret being involved in like that? Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I would much rather have not had any of that in my life at all. And it's certainly not what I expected when I joined the British National Party, but who knows what to expect when joining any organisation? You know, no one has the magnum opus on these things until the lived experience has garnered. And so, yeah, looking back on it, you know, I would much rather have not had it in my life, in truth. But I did, and I don't regret it. Was that day necessary? Yes, absolutely, because they attacked the establishment that we were drinking in with house bricks through the window. You know, and one came flying straight over into the bar, not far from where I was stood, with a guy called Kev from Newark in Nottinghamshire. And yeah, so I remember all of these incidents. And you wouldn't find the SWP doing it unless there'd have been about 2,000 or 3,000 of them, and they'd just been so stunned about a quarter of a mile away previously by the size of the BNP demonstration on Brick Lane that they'd all petered away, they'd all whittled away, you know. They were stunned, quite frankly. They were expecting to see like 200 or 300 of us. When they got there and saw over 2,000 of us, yeah, that really stunned them, really stunned them. And so Red Action, of course, being the most fanatical of the lot, they stayed on, and they sent in their forward Pathfinder units to find us. They were tailing us the whole time. And of course, 18, everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say 18. I don't have to say it because of the YouTube algorithm and the BNP casuals. We were there. In fact, there was also an attachment from Blood and Honor. And yeah, you know, oh, what can I say? I remember it all vividly. And was that direct action necessary? Absolutely. Otherwise, they'd just totally smashed the pub to pieces with everyone inside it, and would have all obtained, you know, some form of serious injury from flying glass. So they had to be stopped, and they were stopped. And you couldn't rely on the coppers. I mean, you probably rely on them to be in league with Red Action, quite frankly, as we saw in April 1993. At the big anti-IRA demonstration when there was about 4,000 of us in the West End. And yeah, I remember being a flag bearer on that. It was more like a parade than a demonstration. It was planned almost like the orange parades in Northern Ireland, with drummer boys at the front and 50 flag bearers, which I was one of. I felt very proud to be one of them. And of course, you don't realise at that moment in time that you're going to be right in the eye of the storm when it kicks off. And that's where I was. And on that day, yeah, absolutely, there was a union of SWP, class war, Red Action. They put aside all of their dialectical differences, particularly over squadism. That was all nonsense anyway. It's just public relations stunt, quite frankly. And also the fact that the SWP just weren't up to squadism, you know. And in truth, neither were class war. That's the reason why they needed all the weapons all the time. I mean, Red Action could usually fight without weapons. I'll say that. They did use weapons, but they could usually fight without them. But class war, different matter entirely. They always needed to have that edge, you see. And so this is what we were up against in the British National Party. This was direct action with the British National Party against Reds. And all these different groups, quite frankly, well, yeah, nearly all of them were committed to violence, to direct action themselves. Although that said, you know, I mean, I did have some very reasonable discussions with lefties. I didn't really call Reds because they weren't the violent types. And you could have an interesting discussion with them, sometimes in a pub, etc., or even a wine bar. And yeah, and that would be the end of the matter, and you just leave it at that. In fact, I remember one night being in a public house near my hometown, and we were just sharing our ideas and beliefs with the SWP crowd there, and some of them were also on the board of class war, and at the end, you know, we said we'll see you tomorrow, and then the following day, obviously, we battled it out, and that's just the way it was. It was very odd, you know, very bizarre. That occasion, yes, just really, really bizarre thinking back on it. But you know, I grew up with most of those guys, you know, and they had, and one of them in particular, his name was Ben. I'll never forget him. Tall guy with blonde hair. He had a really serious attitude problem, really bad attitude problem. He was a year younger than me, and he kept looking at me, and I thought, well, the thing is, you know, if you're looking at me thinking that tomorrow you're going to target me, then you're in for a very unpleasant surprise, sunshine, you know. And the next day he didn't actually. He didn't get anywhere near me. He was already, you know, disincentivized by somewhere else. And so, yeah, I mean, these are the type of experiences that we had. And friends of mine, you know, my 2IC used to talk to the Reds in Nottingham frequently, you know, in between carrying out direct action operations against them, particularly their squats all over the East Midlands. And yeah, they were just fair game. in truth, fair game. And some of them weren't worth bothering with, but some of them were. And, thinking of all those different factions and groups, well, on the whole, yes, I would say, Red Action were the most dangerous because they were the ones who got involved with IRA active service units and INLA, and obviously the letter bombs campaign. Irrespective of who actually did it, Red Action claimed responsibility for it. No one's ever been arrested for it at all, despite all the tales of, the distraction tales about, they came from Denmark, etc. And it was really, C-18 who did it, and it was really the Nationalists who did it to themselves. I mean, drivel. I mean, there was an awful lot of internal conflict. Someone commented on last night's, vlog and said, well, if it hadn't been for those 18 guys, a lot of us would have sustained serious injuries. Perfectly true, yeah. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I'm the first person to say it. But as I explained in the actual docu-series itself, the divorce with 18 and the NS fanatics had to come because at the end of the day, we were going in different directions. And Mr. Tyndall didn't want to go in the direction that they wanted to go in. And I've explained those reasons why. But I think, the thing that always comes back to me all these years later, with my back up against the wall still, in actual fact, although a different type of situation now. I mean, I can laugh about all of it, quite frankly. It's a long time ago. But I can recount it all in vivid detail and laugh about it. And although it wasn't very laughable at the time, in all honesty, there were many nights when I used to go home and think, wow, what a day. And knowing I'd got more of it to come. But that's what I volunteered for. And I think always in 1995, when I'd actually left the BNP, because I didn't renew my membership on the 1st of January 1995 for the reasons I explained before. And I remember later that year watching the film Platoon. And there's that scene in particular, where Charlie Sheen is in the helicopter being, medevaced out of the jungle. And he says, I think now, looking back, we did not fight the enemy. We fought ourselves, and the enemy was in us. That is true. That is true. That is definitely the way I would summarize, my involvement with direct action inside the British National Party against the Reds. I'm sure the Reds have their own story. Why don't they come forward and tell it? Without all the usual bravado and fairy tales. Come forward and be honest and frank about it in the way that I have. I don't think any of them could summon an ounce of honesty to do it. Although I may be pleasantly surprised. Maybe someone will come forward and do it, but I very much doubt it. Honesty and leftism are usually mutually exclusive. But I will reiterate that line, so that people don't forget it, Quite frankly, thinking back, we did not fight the enemy. We fought ourselves, and the enemy was in us because we made one another the enemy, and that's why we didn't succeed.